Welcome to Chronicle Forge.
Picture 1 week in 1759. A London underwriter adjusts insurance premiums because a convoy may be late. A Prussian quartermaster counts flour barrels and knows 2 missed deliveries can break a campaign. In Quebec, officers wait for wind and tide before committing to a move that could decide a continent. In Bengal, company officials discuss revenue rights in the same breath as artillery and troop pay. None of these people share a map table, yet they are inside one connected crisis. The 7 Years' War is often introduced as a chain of battles. That frame is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Why did the stakes become so large across such distant theaters? Battles were visible peaks. The deeper structure was built from credit, logistics, coalition trust, and communication delay. The states that survived were not always the states with the prettiest battlefield diagrams. They were often the states that kept ships moving, lenders calm, and allies provisionally aligned. If you care about how the modern world was built, this conflict matters because it changed scale. European rivalry had gone global before, but not with this level of simultaneous pressure across Europe, North America, the Atlantic, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. What had once been distant imperial friction became a single strategic equation. A port lost in one theater could alter negotiations in another. European rivalry had gone global before, but not with this level of simultaneous pressure across Europe, North America, the Atlantic, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. What had once been distant imperial friction became a single strategic equation. A port lost in one theater could alter negotiations in another. A financial shock in Paris could shape fleet decisions in the Atlantic. A delayed convoy could weaken land options thousands of kilometers away. The war also forced governments to confront a painful truth. Prestige could no longer substitute for systems. You could field brave armies and still fail if supply lines were brittle. You could win tactical episodes and still lose strategic ground if debt became unserviceable. You could gather allies and still fail if coalition goals were never truly synchronized. This documentary follows that system's logic in 9 movements. First, the diplomatic structure that made war likely. Then, the coalition and debt mechanics that governed endurance. Then, the theater stories in North America, India, and the sea lanes. Then, the crisis years, the peace settlements, and the long echo into 1776 and 1789. As you listen, keep one method in view. Do not ask only who won a battle. Ask what made that battle possible. Ask who paid for that move. Ask which institution absorbed the shock. Ask which alliance term held, and which one quietly failed. You will see the war more clearly if you track constraints as closely as commanders. The key question remains open from the first minute. When power stretches across continents, what breaks first? Force, finance, or trust? In the next section, we test whether this conflict was avoidable within the diplomatic structure of the 1750s. Europe after the War of the Austrian Succession looked settled on parchment. It did not feel settled inside ministries. Austria had not reconciled itself to the loss of Silesia. Prussia knew that holding Silesia meant inviting future challenge. France wanted strategic flexibility and status protection. Britain wanted maritime reach without continental entrapment, while still protecting Hanover. Russia watched Prussian growth with rising concern. These preferences did not drift toward harmony over time. They hardened. The diplomatic revolution changed the alignment map and shocked observers who believed old enmities were permanent. Austria moved toward France. Britain moved toward Prussia. This was not only a symbolic switch. It reconfigured expectations about mobilization, subsidy flows, and fear. Once states saw old patterns break, they began planning for broader uncertainty. Frederick II chose a preventive strike into Saxony in 1756. The move was risky and aggressive. It also reflected a strategic calculation that waiting could be worse under perceived encirclement pressure. Historians still debate whether immediate danger was overstated. What is clear is that the strike accelerated coalition formation against Prussia and transformed latent instability into open war. Early campaigns revealed Prussia's strengths and vulnerabilities in the same frame. Discipline, maneuver speed, and command cohesion produced notable victories. Yet manpower depth, replacement capacity, and supply resilience were thin. Prussian success required repeated high-quality performance with little margin for seasonal failure. Austria adapted after early setbacks. Command reforms, better coordination, and persistence increased pressure over time. Russia added mass and strategic weight from the east. France, while uneven in German theaters, remained a critical variable by tying resources and shaping wider coalition possibilities. You can already see the system's lesson. Military outcomes were constrained by harvest cycles, wagon capacity, fodder access, river transport, and treasury endurance. Armies did not move through empty space. They moved through societies that were taxed, requisitioned, and exhausted. Command decisions were strategic, but they were also administrative and material. Political leadership in coalition war faced a second constraint: diverging priorities among nominal partners. Austria prioritized Silesia. Russia sought broader influence and security outcomes that did not always match Austrian timing. France balanced continental obligations with global rivalry and fiscal strain. Coordination costs rose each year. Britain's subsidy policy toward Prussia reflected this reality. London did not subsidize out of sentiment. It subsidized because Prussian resistance imposed strategic opportunity costs on France and its partners. Money served as force multiplier and burden shifter. Subsidies kept partner active without full direct British land commitment at continental scale. One turning episode, Gunnersdorf in 1759, captured both danger and coalition friction. Prussia suffered devastating losses. Collapse seemed plausible, yet coalition follow-through failed to convert tactical success into strategic closure. Why? Exhaustion, supply constraints, and mismatched political aims limited exploitation. Aggregate superiority did not become synchronized execution. By the early 1760s, exhaustion grew everywhere. Then contingency entered. Empress Elizabeth died in 1762. Peter III changed Russian policy toward Prussia. A pressure system built over years shifted abruptly through dynastic change. The episode reminds you that structural forces and contingent events coexist. Institutions determine endurance windows. Leadership shocks determine what happens inside those windows. Before leaving this section, keep one point steady. War became likely not because one actor lost discipline in 1 week. War became likely because unresolved settlement issues, status rivalry, and alliance insecurity persisted across years. The diplomatic architecture was brittle before the first cannon on major fronts. Next chapter, we move from diplomacy to arithmetic, coalition bargaining, debt capacity, and strategic time horizons. Coalition warfare is rarely defeated by rhetoric. It is defeated by misaligned incentives and empty ledgers. During the 7 Years' War, every major actor needed partners. Every major actor also feared being overexposed while others preserved options for peace bargaining. Start with a basic coalition question. Who bears cost first? And who captures gains later? If those answers remain vague, mistrust grows even during successful campaigns. Britain and Prussia manage this tension through subsidies and clear strategic logic. Austria, Russia, and France struggled to keep objectives aligned long enough to produce decisive conversion. Debt financing expanded wartime capability. Governments borrowed against future revenue to move resources into the present. This created immediate power, but only if lenders believed repayment remained plausible. Credibility depended on taxation systems, institutional continuity, and military performance. Poor battlefield outcomes could damage credit. Weak credit could reduce military options. The loop was tight. Britain's fiscal military framework offered relative resilience. Parliament-backed taxation, established credit networks, and maritime commercial depth improved borrowing capacity. This did not mean cheap war. It meant longer endurance under stress. France also borrowed heavily, but faced deeper structural constraints in tax collection and fiscal reform politics. When war burdens rose, these constraints became strategic vulnerabilities. France could still fight hard and innovate tactically, yet sustaining long war at desired scale became increasingly difficult. Prussia's strategy reflected limited reserve depth. Frederick sought tempo, concentration, and repeated disruption. The aim was to prevent larger coalitions from turning weight into stable advantage. That method produced both remarkable results and acute fragility. One poor campaign season could threaten state survival. Austria's reforms improved quality and resilience, but coalition dependence remained. Russia's support was vital, and Russian priorities did not always track Austrian urgency. In long war, diplomacy consumed energy that might otherwise improve campaign coherence. Information speed mattered too. Dispatch lag meant cabinets often governed by delayed understanding. Orders arrived after conditions changed. Field commanders improvised, sometimes effectively, sometimes not. This lag increased blame cycles and reduced trust between political and military levels. Markets signaled strategic stress in real time, better than many official reports. Insurance premiums reflected maritime risk. Commodity volatility reflected transport disruption. Credit spread movement reflected confidence in state solvency. Governments watched these signals because they revealed what future campaigns might be feasible. You can use a simple diagnostic here. If a coalition can still fund replacement, protect shipping, and preserve internal trust after a bad season, it remains strategically alive. If one of those channels fails, rhetoric may continue, but options narrow quickly. There is a human layer as well. Populations tolerate sacrifice only within perceived legitimacy bounds. Taxation, requisition, and conscription pressure can trigger evasion, corruption, and resistance. States that ignore legitimacy arithmetic pay later in governance and compliance. By 1562, debt accumulation and war fatigue constrained all major participants. Strategic goals narrowed from maximal victory to acceptable exit. This is not moral failure. It is how many long wars end, through shrinking feasible objectives. Up next, you will see how these abstract financial and coalition mechanics became concrete on the North American frontier. In North America, conflict began before formal European declarations, because strategic friction was already active in the Ohio Valley. Fort construction, route control, and alliance diplomacy with indigenous nations were not local side stories. They were sovereignty claims in motion. British early operations exposed doctrinal mismatch. Braddock's 1755 expedition toward Fort Duquesne ended in disaster, showing that formal drill did not automatically convert into effectiveness in wooded terrain with fragmented visibility and fluid contact conditions. French strategy in Canada relied on defensive economy, fort chains, mobility, and alliance networks to offset demographic disadvantage against British colonies. This approach sought endurance and leverage rather than total battlefield annihilation. British policy shifted under William Pitt the Elder. Strategic prioritization became clearer. Maritime pressure, concentrated expeditionary action, and stronger integration of regular and colonial resources. Critically, financial support to colonial participation reduced institutional friction. Louisbourg in 1758 opened the St. Lawrence approach and weakened French defensive depth. Quebec in 1759, often remembered as a single dramatic engagement, depended on long preparation in naval movement, intelligence, and timing. Montreal in 1760 marked effective collapse of French control in Canada. Yet strategic success created governance burden. Britain acquired territory and administrative complexity at once. Frontier management, indigenous diplomacy, and defense distribution now required sustained policy capacity and money. Indigenous nations were strategic actors with autonomous goals. Their alliance choices were neither static nor symbolic. They evaluated security, trade, and political autonomy in conditions changed by imperial war. Post-war British policy frequently underestimated this agency, contributing to renewed conflict. Now, notice the imperial paradox. French defeat in Canada removed a major security threat to British colonists. That reduction in external threat also reduced colonial dependence on London's military shield. At the same time, London faced high debt and sought revenue from colonies to fund defense and administration. Expectation mismatch widened. Measures in the 1760s on taxation and imperial control emerged from this post-war fiscal logic. Colonial resistance emerged from constitutional and political logic on representation and authority. The road to later rupture passed directly through post-1763 governance choices. Economic effects were uneven. Wartime contracting enriched some groups. Violence and disruption damaged others. Smuggling and privateering blurred legality and profit incentives. Demobilization produced adjustment shocks that sharpened political grievances. The North American theater, therefore, was not simply a British victory chapter. It was a chapter in which strategic success generated long-term governance risks that imperial institutions struggled to absorb. A little later, we will see a different version of this pattern in India, where corporate power and military force fused in ways that look strikingly modern. The Indian theater is indispensable for understanding why this war reshaped world order. Here, chartered companies behaved as hybrid sovereign actors. They traded, taxed, fortified, negotiated, and fought. Commercial and military logics became inseparable. Regional South Asian politics were already dynamic. Declining central Mughal authority had opened competitive space for successor states, local elites, and military entrepreneurs. European companies entered as additional actors with maritime links, access to external credit, and adaptable military organization. Plassey in 1757 was not a vast mass battle by European standards. It was a compact political military event shaped by elite defection, intelligence positioning, and concentrated force. Its consequence was disproportionate because it expanded British East India Company leverage over Bengal's revenue environment. That revenue leverage mattered strategically. Revenue access financed troops, logistics, and bargaining strength. Financial channels reinforced military channels in a compounding loop. French efforts faced severe constraints from naval weakness, fiscal strain, and alliance fragility. The loss of key positions, including Pondicherry in 1761, reduced French ability to contest British momentum at scale, even though French presence did not vanish entirely. Subway organization revealed institutional adaptation. Companies trained local infantry in disciplined formations, integrated with artillery and command systems suited to regional conditions. This was neither pure European transplant nor purely local continuity. It was a hybrid military labor system with high scaling potential. Corporate governance frictions also mattered. Directors, shareholders, and field officials did not share identical incentives. Extraction pressure, corruption risk, and accountability gaps appeared early. Military success could mask governance weakness in the short term, but not permanently. Local populations experienced these transformations through taxation shifts, security changes, and market disruption. Political order did not transition cleanly from one authority model to another. It moved through contested bargains enforced by force and credit. For strategic analysis, India shows a core modern mechanism. Private organizational forms can execute public geopolitical functions when states and firms are tightly coupled. That coupling can be highly effective and highly unstable. As you evaluate this theater, focus on mechanism rather than myth. Coastal control enabled reinforcement. Revenue access enabled persistence. Alliance fluidity shaped campaign feasibility. None of these factors alone explains outcome. Together, they do. In the next section, we move to the maritime layer that connected Europe, North America, and India into one strategic system. Sea power in this war was not only a story of famous fleet engagements, it was a story about reliable movement. Troops, silver, letters, grain, textiles, and confidence moved along maritime routes. Convoy systems lowered risk. Blockades increased pressure. Privateering redistributed uncertainty. Insurance translated danger into price. Britain's naval advantage rested on institutions as much as ships. Dockyard depth, maintenance routines, labor systems, and fiscal support sustained deployment over time. This was expensive and imperfect, but durable enough to underpin global strategy. France possessed capable officers and fighting potential, yet faced hard trade-offs between theaters under fiscal stress. Concentrating naval assets for one objective exposed vulnerabilities elsewhere. Resource scarcity forced uncomfortable prioritization. Blockade doctrine itself involved strategic trade-offs. Close blockade imposed pressure, but carried weather and attrition risk. Distant blockade reduced immediate exposure, but allowed episodic enemy movement. Admiralties had to balance aggression with sustainability. Maritime outcomes fed directly into finance. A secure convoy season improved expectations for customs and trade revenue. Failed protection raised anxiety and borrowing costs. Investors and officials followed shipping news because it predicted state fiscal room for future campaigns. The celebrated British successes of 1759 were not random spikes. They reflected accumulated institutional preparation, strategic concentration, and adaptive command over prior years. Amphibious operations in Canada and the Caribbean depended on maritime control for timing, reinforcement, and supply continuity. Weather remained a major variable, but without naval access, some operations were impossible regardless of weather. Spanish entry in 1762 widened maritime competition. British captures such as Havana and Manila demonstrated reach and imposed bargaining pressure. Even temporary occupation changed negotiation geometry and exposed defensive weaknesses. Naval outcomes also mattered domestically. Political confidence in ministries rose or fell with maritime performance. That political confidence influenced taxation and borrowing legitimacy, which then fed back into strategic capability. One practical lesson for you as a viewer of long wars is straightforward. Control of movement is often more decisive than dramatic confrontation. If one side can keep goods, men, and information moving with lower risk, it gains strategic time. Soon, we move to the crisis core, Prussia's survival problem under multi-front pressure. Prussia's wartime story became legendary for resilience. The legend captures something real, but it can hide the scale of systemic danger. Survival depended on disciplined command, administrative extraction, coalition friction among enemies, and contingent political shocks. After early successes, pressure intensified from multiple directions. Austria pressed for Silesia. Russia advanced from the east. French and imperial forces constrained options in the west. Prussia had to shift force rapidly with narrow reserve margins. Campaigning imposed severe civilian and economic strain. Requisition, displacement, and agricultural disruption reduced social buffers. Administrative efficiency prolonged resistance, but prolonged extraction carried cumulative cost. Kunersdorf in 1759 was a near-terminal event for Prussia. Casualties were heavy. Command confidence was shaken. Yet, anti-Prussian coalition partners did not convert tactical advantage into final strategic closure. Coordination friction, supply burden, and differing political goals, again, limited exploitation. British subsidies mattered by sustaining continuity. Subsidies did not replace combat capability, but they helped preserve strategic endurance at critical moments. Frederick's command style favored decisive risk because prolonged attritional balance favored larger coalitions. This generated both high returns and high exposure. Strategic brilliance and strategic brittleness coexisted. Then came the Russian succession shock in 1762. Empress Elizabeth died. Peter III reversed policy toward Prussia. Years of coalition pressure shifted abruptly. For Vienna, this was a severe strategic disruption. For Prussia, it was relief that battlefield performance alone had not guaranteed. This section matters because it demonstrates a general rule. Tactical excellence does not guarantee durable strategic position when replacement depth and fiscal bandwidth are constrained. Conversely, near defeat is not always terminal when opposing coalitions cannot maintain synchronized pressure. As we close this crisis movement, keep your eye on interaction effect, administrative stamina, coalition coherence, and leadership contingency combine to produce outcome. Next chapter, we examine peace terms and why settlement did not end structural risk. The Treaties of Paris and Hubertusburg in 1763 ended major fighting. They did not end strategic consequences. Territorial results were clear in some theaters. Fiscal consequences were severe almost everywhere. Britain emerged with expanded imperial position, especially in North America, and stronger maritime leverage. France lost major holdings and faced deeper questions about fiscal capacity and strategic scale. Spain absorbed shocks and adjusted through reform efforts. In Central Europe, Prussia retained Silesia, preserving great power status. Map outcomes were visible and politically legible. Debt burdens were less visible and more dangerous. Wartime borrowing had expanded state capability, but debt service now demanded sustained revenue and political consent in peacetime. Britain's post-war governance challenge was acute. Expanded imperial obligations met high debt. London sought colonial contribution to defense and administration. Colonial political communities interpreted these moves through constitutional arguments on representation and authority. Conflict over fiscal legitimacy followed. France faced a different path to pressure. Fiscal reform, difficulty under privilege structures, limited flexibility. Debt service consumed policy bandwidth. Repeated reform attempts without durable resolution increased long-run fragility. Spain intensified reform to strengthen imperial defense and administration after wartime shocks. Gains were real in some domains, but reform also created new local frictions. Demobilization affected societies unevenly. Veterans returned into adjusting economies. Contract networks shifted. Border zones remained tense, where sovereignty changed faster than governance capacity. Diplomatically, rivalry did not disappear. It reset under new constraints and lessons. Military and naval institutions codified experience. Financial administrators revised risk assumptions. Public debate on taxation and political voice widened. One crucial insight appears here. Peace settlements can terminate campaigns while preserving or even amplifying constitutional and fiscal tensions. If those tensions are unmanaged, the post-war decade becomes pre-crisis rather than recovery. In the next section, we test whether the post-1763 world directly fed the revolutionary era or merely coincided with it. To assess legacy responsibly, avoid single-cause storytelling. The 7 Years' War did not mechanically cause later revolutions. It did, however, intensify the fiscal and governance conditions that made rupture more likely in key states. In British North America, wartime outcomes changed both security context and political expectations. With French threat reduced, dependence on metropolitan military protection declined. London's demand for revenue and administrative control increased. Constitutional conflict sharpened. Escalation followed. In France, defeat and debt amplified structural fiscal weaknesses. Reform barriers remained high. Financial stress mounted over decades. By the late 1780s, crisis moved from treasury management to regime-level political transformation. Prussia emerged with enhanced status but heavy social and material costs. Austria and Russia adapted institutions in response to wartime lessons. Across Europe, competitive statecraft became more administrative, more data-conscious, and more sensitive to fiscal endurance. Globally, policymakers learned that overseas theaters could not be treated as detached side arenas. Revenue channels, naval logistics, and coalition commitments formed one interconnected strategic field. India's wartime transformations accelerated corporate imperial governance models. Debates on accountability, sovereignty, and extraction intensified as company power expanded. Methodologically, this war teaches you to read history across scales. Local battles matter. They matter more when linked to supply systems, debt structures, alliance bargaining, and political consent. If you apply one practical framework from this story, use this sequence. First, identify pressure channels. Second, test institutional capacity under shock. Third, track legitimacy of burden sharing. Fourth, monitor how short-term strategic gains alter long-term governance cost. The calm conclusion is not comforting, but it is useful. Great powers rarely fail from one dramatic collapse alone. They fail when force, finance, and trust weaken together across connected theaters. The 7 Years' War shows this pattern early and clearly. As you close this documentary, you can carry one final inference. Modern global competition did not begin in the 20th century. Its grammar was already visible in the mid-18th. States learned that range without resilience is dangerous, and victory without fiscal design can become strategic debt with delayed political interest. That is why this war still matters. It is not a distant prelude. It is an early manual on how interconnected power works, how it overreaches, and how it can unravel unless institutions remain coherent under pressure. Extended documentary layer begins here. The first extension you need is annual tempo. In 1756, the conflict formalized after frontier violence had already prepared the ground. In 1757, campaign intensity rose in Central Europe, and the coalition map began to reveal its internal tension. In 1758, maritime and expeditionary coordination improved on the British side, producing strategic effects greater than any single headline battle. In 1759, victories that later looked inevitable were still fragile when they occurred. In 1760 and 1761, everyone was paying compound cost in men, materials, and credibility. In 1762, leadership contingency in Russia altered the strategic equation abruptly. In 1763, treaties ended major fighting while preserving fiscal pressure that governments could not simply wish away. When you hear this timeline, do not treat each year as a separate box. Think of cumulative pressure. Each year inherited unresolved burden from the previous year. Supply repair was never complete. Debt service did not pause. Coalition bargaining did not become easier through fatigue. Civilian tolerance did not reset at campaign season boundaries. The system carried memory. A second extension is fiscal architecture at working level. Britain's advantage was not abstract national character. It came from institutional routines that connected taxation, borrowing, and naval maintenance over time. Creditors believed the state could continue to collect and service obligations, so the state could borrow at scale and sustain fleet presence. That institutional loop made strategy executable. French fiscal strain was not simply about spending too much in 1 year. It was about structural limits in revenue extraction and reform feasibility. When wartime demands spiked, these limits became visible as strategic constraints. Military competence still existed. Strategic ambition still existed. The trouble was endurance under compounded cost and uneven reform capacity. Austria and Russia mobilized significant resources and adapted materially, but coalition synchronization remained costly. Prussia's fiscal and demographic profile demanded a high-risk command method. Britain used subsidy to shape continental pressure indirectly. These distinct fiscal positions explain why actors pursued different operational rhythms, even when they were nominally aligned against the same enemy. A third extension is logistics, as daily reality rather than textbook category. Armies marched on bread, forage, draft power, powder transport, and replacement schedules. Fleet endurance depended on hull maintenance, rope supply, sailcloth, dockyard throughput, and disease management. A commander could hold superior intent and still fail when transport timing slipped by days. A ministry could issue coherent policy and still fail when convoy sequencing misaligned with weather windows. In North America, roads and river corridors could decide campaign feasibility more than bravado. In India, port access and monsoon, aware timing shaped reinforcement credibility. In Europe, seasonal constraints and magazine planning often determined whether tactical opportunity could be exploited or only observed. If you want one practical image, use this. Strategy was a moving machine with many belts. A battlefield victory turned one belt faster. But if fuel, labor, repair, and financing belts slowed, the whole machine lost output. The 7 Years' War is full of moments where tactical acceleration met systemic drag. A fourth extension is maritime finance in detail. Insurance pricing was not an academic footnote. Underwriters and merchants priced risk from convoy quality, route exposure, seasonality, and enemy activity. Premium changes influenced shipping behavior. Shipping behavior influenced customs and trade revenue. Revenue expectations influenced borrowing conditions. Borrowing conditions influenced campaign options. Maritime risk moved through the entire strategic stack. This mechanism helps explain why naval protection had macro effect. Protecting convoy lanes did not only preserve cargo, it preserved confidence. Confidence supported credit. Credit supported fleets and armies. In modern language, sea control stabilized the operating system of imperial war. A fifth extension is coalition trust. Coalition agreements can appear solid at signature moment, then erode in campaign reality. Partners ask hard questions. Who advanced where? Who paid what? Who consumed reserves? Who delayed support? Who gains in peace terms if this offensive succeeds? These questions were always present, often unspoken in public declarations, and decisive in private planning. Even successful coalition operations could degrade trust if burden sharing felt uneven. Even failed operations could preserve coalition viability if partners believed burdens and risks were distributed in acceptable proportion. This is why coalition governance belongs in the core of strategic analysis, not in an appendix. A sixth extension is civilian and social burden, war requisition, taxation, price disruption, and displacement altered compliance behavior. States needed not only legal authority, but practical legitimacy to continue extraction. Where people viewed burdens as arbitrary or unequal, evasion and resistance increased. That mattered directly for military sustainability. In British North America, post-war tax and administrative measures were interpreted through local political expectations shaped during wartime contribution. In France, structural inequality in fiscal burden intensified legitimacy strain when reform remained blocked. In many regions, post-war order inherited wartime grievance rather than replacing it. A seventh extension is indigenous diplomacy in North America. Indigenous nations calculated alliance choices based on autonomy, security, and strategic geography. Their agency influenced frontier outcomes materially. Any narration that treats them as background misses core mechanism. European empires operated within political landscapes they could affect but not fully control. A similar principle applied in India with regional elites and power brokers. Company strategies succeeded when they integrated local political realities and failed when they assumed external templates could substitute for regional negotiation. An eighth extension concerns historiography. Some claims are strongly anchored in documentary evidence, chronology, treaty provisions, major force movements, and institutional reforms. Other claims remain interpretive, counterfactual outcomes, internal motive weighting, and precise causality across distant theaters. High-quality documentary narration should distinguish clearly between what records establish and what interpretation proposes. This distinction is not a weakness. It is a professional discipline. You do not strengthen narrative by pretending certainty where evidence is partial. You strengthen narrative by naming confidence levels and showing mechanism chains that remain plausible under evidence limits. A ninth extension is strategic method transfer. If you apply 7 years' war lessons to modern analysis, you should ask 5 operational questions. First, where does endurance funding come from, and how fragile is that source? Second, what movement network is decisive, and how contested is it? Third, how coherent is coalition burden sharing under stress? Fourth, what legitimacy reserve exists for continued extraction? Fifth, what contingent leadership event could abruptly reprice risk? These 5 questions do not predict everything, but they prevent shallow evaluation. They force you to examine systems, not only episodes. A 10th extension is legacy pacing. The link to 1776 and 1789 is not linear destiny. It is structured pressure transmission. War debt, governance choices, reform constraints, and representation conflict interacted over years. Time delay made causality less visible to contemporaries, but not less real. In British imperial context, debt and security management choices triggered constitutional conflict with colonies. In French context, debt and reform blockage deepened regime fragility. In broader European context, administrative and military adaptation accelerated competitive state development. In imperial context, corporate power expanded where revenue and force combined. If you stand back now, the central pattern is clear. The war integrated theaters, institutions, and markets into one strategic field. Actors could still think locally, but outcomes were increasingly shaped globally. The closing implication for you is practical. When you evaluate modern great power competition, avoid the temptation to overrate visible confrontation and underrate system maintenance. Logistics, finance, alliance trust, and political consent remain decisive channels. You can end this story with a steady conclusion rather than a dramatic slogan. The 7 Years' War did not simply redraw maps. It changed expectations about what power required. It taught states that range demanded resilience, that campaigns demanded credit, and that victory could create governance costs larger than anticipated. That is why the conflict remains useful as a working model. It shows how interconnected wars are managed, mismanaged, financed, and remembered. It also shows why coherent institutions matter more than temporary momentum when pressure persists across years. End of script. Final analytical extension. Consider 4 short case snapshots that capture system interaction with unusual clarity. Snapshot 1 is the St. Lawrence campaign environment. Naval access, pilot knowledge, seasonal timing, and river movement capacity all had to align. You can read this as a military episode, but it is equally a logistics and information episode. If weather closed opportunity windows, command intent was irrelevant. If naval support lagged, land confidence dropped. If land planning ignored maritime constraints, operational risk multiplied. A famous battlefield outcome sat on top of this infrastructure stack. Snapshot 2 is Bengal's revenue military loop. Political bargaining and selective coercion shifted fiscal access. Fiscal access funded military payroll and procurement. Military posture then strengthened bargaining leverage for further fiscal claims. This was not a one-direction process. Miscalculation in any stage could create backlash and instability. Yet when the loop held, it generated compounding strategic capacity. Snapshot 3 is coalition war in Central Europe. Partners shared adversaries but not identical end states. Tactical opportunities appeared, but coordinated exploitation required synchronized risk appetite and supply readiness. Where one partner viewed continued offensive as prudent, another viewed it as excessive exposure. You can call this disagreement, yet it is more accurate to call it incentive divergence under uncertainty. Snapshot 4 is maritime insurance signaling. Convoy risk estimates altered premium levels. Premium levels influenced merchant behavior and route decisions. Those decisions changed trade continuity and customs expectations. Fiscal expectations then shaped state borrowing options. Borrowing options shaped campaign tempo. In this chain, market behavior and strategic behavior are intertwined. These snapshots help explain why the war remains analytically valuable. They show how systems produce outcomes that no single actor fully controls. One last methodological note can strengthen your reading. Distinguish between narrative sequence and causal weight. Events happen in sequence. Causes carry different weight. The order of episodes does not automatically reveal which mechanism mattered most. You need evidence discipline to avoid over-attributing decisive power to the most dramatic scene. For this reason, professional-grade documentary writing should keep 3 lanes visible at once. Lane 1 is chronological clarity, so the audience does not lose orientation. Lane 2 is mechanism clarity, so the audience understands why events move. Lane 3 is confidence clarity, so the audience knows where evidence is firm and where interpretation remains open. When these 3 lanes stay synchronized, narration feels authoritative without becoming dogmatic. When one lane dominates, quality drops. Pure chronology becomes list-making. Pure mechanism becomes abstract lecture. Pure uncertainty language becomes evasive. Balance is the quality target. Carry that balance into the final takeaway. The 7 Years' War demonstrated that global competition rewards states that align military action with fiscal realism, logistics reliability, and coalition management. It also demonstrated that even successful powers can inherit destabilizing post-war burdens. If you keep this dual insight, you read the conflict as more than a historical chapter. You read it as a systems case with continuing relevance for how modern power is organized, financed, and contested. Extended Narrative Block A. To deepen the European arc, it helps to compare command problems at 3 levels. At tactical level, commanders sought favorable engagement geometry. At campaign level, they sought movement sequences that preserved supply viability. At strategic level, they sought outcomes that remained politically fundable. The difficulty was that these 3 levels did not always align. A tactically attractive battle could consume irreplaceable manpower. A campaign maneuver that preserved forces could look passive in domestic politics. A strategically prudent pause could be misread by allies as declining commitment. These tensions are visible across the war, and they explain why apparently rational decisions often produced criticism in real time. Another underused lens is administrative velocity. Everyone talks about military speed, yet administrative speed frequently decided what military speed could achieve. Could a government process contracts in time? Could transport requisitions be executed before weather changed? Could replacements be trained and moved before the next campaign window closed? In a multi-theater war, delays compound. One delayed contract can delay one convoy. One delayed convoy can reduce one campaign option. One reduced option can force command decisions that look reckless from outside, but were constrained from inside. Extended Narrative Block B. North American warfare also deserves a social terrain reading. Frontier environments were not empty strategic canvases. They were inhabited landscapes with layered political relationships, trade dependencies, and territorial claims. European officers who treated these areas as purely military maps underestimated the political intelligence required for durable control. Alliance diplomacy with indigenous nations was not supplementary. It was central to movement security, information access, and local legitimacy. British post-conquest governance dilemmas reveal the difference between military seizure and political settlement. Military operations can deliver control of forts and towns quickly. Political settlement requires institutional trust, legal adaptation, and administrative consistency over years. Where these conditions were weak, post-war order remained unstable. This distinction helps explain why empire could appear stronger on maps while becoming more fragile in governance practice. Commercial actors in colonial settings further complicated policy. Merchants, contractors, and local intermediaries pursued profit under changing legal regimes. Their behavior could support state objectives in one phase and undermine them in another. Smuggling, speculative contracting, and opportunistic arbitration were not anomalies. They were recurrent features in systems where law, war, and market incentives overlap. Extended narrative Block C. In India, one critical mechanism was information brokerage. Company officials, court factions, bankers, military entrepreneurs, and regional elites all operated with partial information and selective disclosure. Decisions were rarely made under full transparency. Actors traded intelligence, signals, and promises, often with strategic ambiguity. This produced outcomes that looked sudden from outside, but were prepared through incremental bargaining. Revenue rights were especially decisive because they transformed political access into repeatable resource flows. A one-time battlefield success might bring temporary prestige. A stable revenue arrangement could sustain payroll, procurement, and diplomatic payments across seasons. Where revenue extraction became aggressive without political calibration, resistance rose. Where extraction was tied to negotiated local order, durability improved. This was not moral simplification. It was political economy in motion. The corporate-state hybrid model generated accountability gaps. Directors in Europe evaluated returns and risk through delayed reports. Field officials managed immediate threats and opportunities. Local partners judged credibility through concrete behavior, not charter language. Misalignment among these time horizons produced recurrent governance instability. Yet despite instability, the model could still outcompete rivals when it combined finance force and adaptive bargaining effectively. Extended narrative Block D. Maritime operations merit a closer operational look. Fleet readiness depended on labor discipline, dockyard throughput, maintenance intervals, and provisioning cycles. Even a capable fleet degraded without scheduled repair and replacement. Disease management was an operational variable, not a medical footnote. Sickness rates could reduce effective manpower faster than combat losses in some periods. Convoy doctrine required balancing concentration and distribution. Overconcentration could protect high-value traffic, but leave secondary routes exposed. Overdistribution could dilute escort quality and increase cumulative risk. Admiralties had to decide where risk was acceptable and where failure would generate disproportionate strategic cost. Prize capture and privateering introduced additional complexity. Captures could generate immediate gain and political morale effects, but private violence also imposed uncertainty on commercial scheduling. Governments had to manage this uncertainty while preserving enough predictability for taxation and credit confidence. In practice, maritime strategy combined coercion and reassurance. States needed to threaten enemy routes and stabilize their own. Caribbean campaigns add another layer. Islands carried major economic value relative to size. Their transfer in war and negotiation influenced bargaining leverage far beyond local geography. However, tropical campaigning imposed severe health and supply burdens. High-value objectives did not remove high operational risk. Extended narrative Block E. The war's communication environment shaped decision quality. Dispatches traveled slowly. Reports were incomplete. Rumors competed with verified intelligence. Leaders made choices under asymmetric uncertainty and often revised policy after events had already shifted. This environment rewarded institutions that tolerated adaptive correction. It punished institutions that confused delayed certainty with real-time control. A useful analytical distinction here is between error and rigidity. Error is inevitable in high uncertainty systems. Rigidity is optional and costly. States that accepted controlled correction could recover from error faster. States that denied correction accumulated strategic debt in the form of repeated misallocation. Public narrative management also mattered. Governments needed domestic audiences to tolerate extraction and sacrifice. Symbolic victories helped maintain confidence. But propaganda had limits when material conditions worsened. If prices rose, wages lagged, and casualties mounted, narrative without adjustment lost power. Legitimacy was partly rhetorical and partly distributive. Both mattered. War memory formation began before peace treaties. Contemporary reporting elevated certain heroes and episodes while obscuring systems factors. This selective memory influenced later military culture. It offered inspiration, yet sometimes encouraged overconfidence in decisive battle solutions while underweighting logistics and finance. Extended narrative block F. By the peace settlements, decision-makers faced dual accounting. One ledger tracked territorial outcomes. Another tracked debt service obligations, administrative burden, and political fragility. The first ledger was public and celebratory. The second ledger was technical and less visible, yet often more predictive of future instability. In Britain, expanded imperial obligations required durable fiscal design and constitutional sensitivity across diverse political communities. In France, strategic revision required fiscal reform that repeatedly met structural resistance. In Spain, reform energy increased, but implementation varied by region and institution. In Central Europe, status outcomes did not erase material damage. These post-war burdens did not produce identical trajectories. They altered probability landscapes. Some pathways led to reform, some to managed adaptation, and some to political rupture. The war's legacy is best understood as pressure redistribution across institutions rather than deterministic causation. If you translate this to modern strategic reasoning, one principle stands out. Grand strategy is not only about choosing objectives, it is about choosing objective portfolios that institutions can sustain under shock. Ambition without sustainment logic creates delayed failure even when short-term gains look impressive. A final steady point for the listener. Evidence supports strong claims about mechanisms, but not every internal motive can be resolved with certainty. Professional narration should remain clear about that boundary. Confidence where records are strong, caution where records are partial. This is not weakness. It is rigor, closing extension. You now have the full picture in layered form. Diplomacy set the conditions. Coalition bargaining shaped options. Debt financed tempo and narrowed futures. Logistics translated plans into movement or paralysis. Maritime control linked theaters. Corporate and imperial governance transformed war gains into long-term administrative burdens. Post-war settlements ended fighting but transmitted fiscal and constitutional pressure into the next era. If you revisit the opening question, the answer is not a single variable. Force, finance, and trust reinforced and degraded one another. Armies weakened when supply and pay weakened. Alliances weakened when burden sharing lost credibility. Finances weakened when strategy promised more than institutions could deliver. That interaction pattern is the enduring lesson. It makes the 7 Years' War more than a prelude to later revolutions. It makes the war a structural case study in how global competition works when distance no longer protects any major actor from system-wide feedback. Supplementary comparative block. To push the interpretation one level deeper, compare this war with later global conflicts through systems categories rather than weapon technology. Category 1 is mobilization finance. Category 2 is movement control. Category 3 is coalition governance. Category 4 is social legitimacy under extraction. The 7 Years' War already displays all 4 categories in mature interaction. Mobilization finance appears in debt issuance, taxation adjustment, and lender confidence dynamics. Movement control appears in convoy design, blockade pressure, inland supply routing, and seasonal timing. Coalition governance appears in subsidy diplomacy, burden negotiation, and divergence between shared enemies and distinct end states. Social legitimacy appears in compliance behavior, protest response, and constitutional argument under fiscal stress. When these categories are synchronized, strategic endurance rises. When one category degrades, others absorb stress and can eventually fail in sequence. This sequence logic helps explain why some states appeared strong in one season and vulnerable the next without any single catastrophic battle. Another useful comparison is between visible command and hidden administration. Command decisions are visible and narratively attractive. Administrative throughput is hidden and narratively quiet, yet hidden throughput often determines whether visible command decisions are executable. The 7 Years' War repeatedly confirms this relationship. Take replacement systems as an example. A brilliant plan requires personnel, transport, food, and payment to function beyond first contact. If replacement capacity cannot sustain losses and fatigue, tactical achievement decays into strategic attrition. States that understood this could trade space and time more rationally. States that ignored this suffered preventable exhaustion. One more angle concerned strategic patience. In long conflicts, leaders face pressure for immediate symbolic results. Symbolic results can sustain morale, but pursuit of symbolism at the expense of system maintenance can erode long-run position. The war offers several episodes where measured consolidation outperformed dramatic overreach. For documentary interpretation, this means pacing matters. A high-quality narrative should alternate event immediacy with mechanism explanation. Too much immediacy creates spectacle without understanding. Too much mechanism creates abstraction without emotional grip. Balanced pacing helps listeners retain both memory and meaning. As a listener, you can apply a practical check when evaluating any future war narrative. Ask whether the story explains how money moved, how supplies moved, how alliances were managed, and how political legitimacy was sustained. If these channels are absent, the narrative is likely incomplete, regardless of battlefield detail. This final supplement reinforces the central conclusion. The 7 Years' War was a turning conflict because it revealed the operating requirements of global power in connected systems. It showed that projection range, financial durability, alliance management, and administrative coherence must be treated as one strategic package. Any actor that separates them invites delayed failure.